On some nights, faith doesn't begin with a prayer. It begins with a sound you can't quite place, and an animal that refuses to move. Out in the high desert of northern Arizona, there's a little highway town most people only know as a gas stop and a bathroom break. A place with one blinking traffic light, a diner that still smells like coffee from 1983, and an old white wooden church set back from the road. The church isn't much to look at. Paint peeling, cross a little crooked, concrete steps cracked in a way that makes you walk carefully. Most Sundays, you could count the congregation with both hands and have fingers left over. But on one winter night, those worn-out steps held more life than anyone inside that building had seen in a long time. The air was sharp enough to sting your lungs. The security light above the door hummed and flickered, throwing the small circle of cold yellow onto the top step. That's where she sat. A bobcat. Not in a field, not in the shadow of a rock. Right there, on the top step of a human church, shoulders squared toward the door, tufted ears pricked forward as if she were waiting her turn. Later, the wildlife officer would call her Luna. But in that moment, she was just a wild bobcat, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Except that she wasn't alone. If you'd been close enough, you would have seen how her front paws curved in just a little tighter than normal, how her chest didn't rise and fall with the easy rhythm of sleep, but with a careful, protective tension. Pressed up against her, wrapped in a worn blue jacket, lay a young woman, barely out of her teens, curled into herself on the cold concrete. Unconscious, breathing, but shallow, skin far too pale for this kind of night. It should not have been safe. A wild bobcat this close to a vulnerable human body is usually a story about danger, not rescue. And yet for hours, through the kind of desert cold that seeps into bone, Luna did something no field guide would have predicted. She stayed. Every time the wind knifed down off the ridge and across the churchyard, Luna shifted her weight, angling her body between that wind and the still figure beneath her. Her fur caught the frost. Her whiskers twitched at every new sound. A semi groaning past out on the highway, a loose piece of tin tapping somewhere on the roof, a distant dog barking at nothing. Inside the parsonage, right behind the church, Pastor Blair Collins slept in a small bedroom that suddenly felt too large after his wife died. On his nightstand, a glass of water, a pair of reading glasses, and a Bible he knew by heart but still opened, mostly out of habit. He had no idea that just a few yards away from his thin bedroom wall, a wild animal and a stranger's daughter were sharing a step and a night they were never meant to share. The security camera above the church door caught only pieces of it. A shadow slipping in from the dark, low and graceful, paws silent on the concrete, a pause at the bottom step, a cautious sniff. Another step, and then that surprising decision. Instead of turning away, Luna folded herself down over the bundled body, as if the step had always been meant for the two of them together. Maybe you've had a night like that, in your own way. A night when you were out of good options, when the world felt too cold and too loud, and you ended up someplace you never planned to be. A hospital waiting room, a parking lot, the edge of your own bed. You might not have had a bobcat watching over you, but you remember how small and raw you felt, how you wished, just for a moment, that something bigger than you would sit close and not leave. That's what makes this scene so hard to shake. It isn't just the oddity of a bobcat on a church step. It's the sense that, for a few hours, the hard lines between wild and human, sacred ground and cracked concrete, all blurred into one quiet act of keeping watch. By the time Blair's alarm went off, the sky in the east was just beginning to think about light. He shuffled to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and moved through his routine the way you do when you've been doing the same thing for 40 years. Make coffee, check notes for a sermon you're not sure matters, put on the old wool coat. He wasn't expecting anyone new that morning. The church had been shrinking for years. He'd prayed for something to do that still matters, but he imagined that as another hospital visit, another casserole delivered to a grieving family, not whatever was waiting just beyond his front door. crossed the short distance from parsonage to sanctuary, key cold in his hand. When he pushed the double doors open and stepped out toward the bell rope, he stomped so fast the door nudged him in the back. There, at arm's length, sat Luna, thus winter coat fluffed, eyes golden and unblinking in the half-light. For a split second, Blair saw what any rancher would see, a predator too close to people. His breath caught. Every sensible thing in him wanted to back up slowly and go call someone with a tranquilizer gun. Then the bundle under Luna's chest shifted, and a soft, broken sound rose from it. Not quite a word, not quite a groan, just the fragile sound a human makes when their body is trying to come back. Blair's whole life pivoted on that sound. In one heartbeat, this wasn't just a bobcat problem or a church property problem. It was a life problem. A "you move now or you may not get another chance" problem. As he backed into the sanctuary to reach for the phone, hands trembling, you can almost hear the thoughts tangling in his mind. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something like the first spark of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. In a minute, we'll slip behind this moment and follow Luna back into the hills to see how a wild mother ended up here at all. Because to understand why a bobcat would choose a church step over open country, we have to step into her nights before this one. For now, as you listen, you might let yourself picture a place from your own life that feels a little worn and forgotten, like that old church. And just hold this question gently. What if it's exactly the kind of place where something unexpected could sit down on your front step and refuse to leave? Follow Luna back to the land she lost and the life that pushed her toward the edge of town. Before Luna ever touched a church step, her whole world was rock, sky, and a map only a wild bobcat could read. On the ridge above town, where the pinyon pines hunch down against the wind and the soil turns to pale dust, Luna's life followed a quiet pattern. Not a tame pattern, not a safe one, but a steady rhythm that made sense to her. When the sun slid behind the mesas, she would lift herself from the shallow scrape she used as a den and pause, listening. The high desert goes strangely loud at dusk, if you know what to hear. Crickets tuning up, a dove calling once before it settles, the thin scurry of a mouse crossing open ground too late. For a bobcat, this is the working day. She moved, like all her kind do when no one is watching. A few steps, then stillness. Then another careful slide between rocks. The spots along her sides broke up her shape, turned her into a piece of shadow. Out there she lived off rabbits, mice, and the occasional unwary quail. A good night meant a solid meal and the strength to return to the ledge where, tucked beneath a shelf of stone, her small family waited. People don't always realize how wide a bobcat's territory can be. A single mother can roam over several square miles, following the same paths again and again, the way you might take the same route to work or to the grocery store without thinking. Every rock, every bush, every faint scent on the wind becomes part of a living map. Take away one piece, and the rest feels off. In those early months, Luna had everything she needed. The ledge held warmth even after dark. The slope below gave her a clear view of anything that approached. On cold nights, she would press herself around her litter, feeling tiny bodies breathe against her belly, the dry tickle of kitten fur under her chin. Then, one night, the ground began to hum. At first, it was distant, a vibration that didn't match thunder and didn't match trains, a low mechanical rumble that came and went, like a storm that never quite arrived. She would pause on her hunting path, ears tipping forward, then go back to work. Weeks later, orange flags appeared along the ridge, bright in the pale grass. Metal stakes clinked against stone. The smell of diesel drifted in on the wind. During the day, while Luna lay tight in the rock shadow, strange vehicles crawled across the hillside above her like bright-colored beetles. In town, folks called it a new housing development. Desert View Estates, the sign said in friendly letters. A place for people who loved the idea of living near open land, not thinking too hard about who already called that land home. Up on the ridge, the change felt different. Where Luna once heard coyotes yipping and owls calling, She began to hear backing alarms and the sharp crack of rock under pressure. Her map shifted. Familiar trails ended at orange plastic fencing. A wash she used to follow now held muddy tire tracks and piles of broken stone. One stormy afternoon, when dark clouds pushed low and heavy across the sky, the machines didn't stop. They cut into the slope just above Luna's den, carving terraces into the soft earth. Water started to run in new directions, slicing channels through soil that had held together for decades. Luna did what wild mothers do when they sense danger. She moved her kittens deeper under the rock and went out to hunt fast, hoping to be back before the worst of the weather. By the time she returned, the hillside above her had changed shape. A section of freshly loosened ground had slumped downward, packing her den entrance with wet earth, stones, and broken roots. The hollow where her litter had been was sealed as if it had never existed. No one can say exactly what went through her mind. Animals don't grieve as we do, but any rancher who's watched a cow stand over a lost calf or a dog search a burned-out house for days knows that loss is not only a human language. Luna pressed her nose to the packed soil, paws working at the edge until her claws were dark. The storm thickened. Wind drove cold rain sideways across the ridge. At some point, soaked and exhausted, she turned away from the buried hollow and did the only thing left to do. She walked. In the weeks that followed, Luna's range stretched and twisted. The old roots no longer held. Where she once slipped between junipers, she now found raw cuts of roadbed and stacks of lumber. The night smells changed from sage and dust to hot asphalt, trash, and the metallic tang of streetlights. She followed the easiest paths downhill, along a newly cut access road, under a chain-link fence someone had left gapped, across a drainage ditch filled with runoff from sprinklers. Rabbits were harder to find here. Instead, she began seeing the soft bodies of rats near the back of restaurants, the occasional chicken in a yard with a poorly latched gate. If you've ever driven into your hometown after a few years away and not recognized half the storefronts, you know a little of what this is like. A grocery store was replaced by a chain, a field turned into a parking lot. You still know where you are, but the landmarks your heart uses are gone. For Luna, every new building was one more piece of her map erased. She started to show up near the edges of people's stories, caught for a moment in a gas station security camera, eyes glowing in the dark, seen trotting along the dry riverbed behind a trailer park, reported by someone taking out the trash behind the diner. Thought it was a big house cat at first. Then I saw the ears. Most folks just shook their heads and said, "Guess the wildlife is moving in closer." The truth was simpler and harder. People had moved out farther, into places wild animals had been using for generations. The bobcat was not invading. She was adjusting to a world that had shifted underneath her. By the time Luna reached the edge of the church property, she was already a mother whose den had been buried, a hunter whose land had been sliced apart. Her instinct was still to find shelter, warmth, the sound of breathing that needed her. That's what wild mothers do. They look for what they can still protect. And down in town, not far from those Pinyon Hills, there was someone else trying to read a changed map. A young woman, alone in a car that didn't always start, parked in whatever lot felt safe enough for one more night. She too was figuring out how to live when the life she'd planned had collapsed. In a moment, we'll sit with her for a while, with Elena at the edge of a laundromat parking lot and the edge of her courage, to see how her road and Luna's would end up crossing on those cracked church steps. As you listen, you might think about the last place in your own life that stopped feeling like home. A street, a job, a routine, and you might hold that memory gently, the way Luna once held her kittens, as we turn toward a human story that's every bit as fragile as a wild one. Some stories of faith begin in a pew. Elena began behind the steering wheel, parked under a buzzing streetlight, trying not to be seen. For weeks before that winter night, her world had shrunk down to the inside of an old sedan, and whatever parking lot felt safe enough until morning. The back seat held a duffel bag, a folded fast food uniform, and a blanket that smelled faintly of French fries and fabric softener. The front held the rest of her life. A half-empty coffee cup, a cracked phone, and a small, worn Bible she kept shoved deep in the glove compartment. She hadn't always lived like this. She'd grown up 2 towns over, in a house where Sunday mornings meant stained glass light on the carpet and polite greetings in a crowded foyer. Her family sat 3 rows from the front, sang from the same hymn book, and bowed their heads when told. When she left home, it wasn't because she stopped believing in God. It was because she couldn't bear the thought of walking down that center aisle with a visible belly and a story no one would fully know. Shame is a powerful engine. It can run a car farther than a full tank of gas. So she drove, worked when she could, parked where no one asked questions. All the while, the quiet weight of another life grew inside her, turning, pressing, reminding her that the clock was ticking toward a day she felt completely unprepared to meet. In the weeks before the birth, you could have found her in ordinary places at odd hours, suddenly in the corner of a laundromat, watching other people's clothes spin while she charged her phone, standing in line at the dollar store, buying crackers and bottled water, pulling into a gas station and deliberately choosing a pump that didn't face the bright church on the hill so she wouldn't have to see the cross on its roof. Sometimes, late at night, she would open that glove compartment and let the little Bible fall into her lap. She didn't read long passages. She just ran a thumb along the edge of the pages, feeling the thin paper, remembering how it had once sounded to hear those words from a pulpit. Then the embarrassment would rise, embarrassment that she could still feel comfort there after everything, and she'd snap it shut and shove it back, as if someone might see. Still, now and then the words slipped out of her anyway. Gripping the wheel at a red light, feeling the baby press hard against her ribs, she whispered, "I'm sorry," into the empty car. She wasn't sure whether she was talking to God, the child, or both. The night it all came due was colder than the weather reports had promised. The kind of cold that seeps through the seams of a car door and finds your bones. Contractions started as a dull ache, the way they say they do. But she told herself it was just nerves or something she ate. She drove aimlessly for a while, one hand pressed to her side, headlights tracing the same empty streets. By the time she admitted to herself that this was real labor, she was too far from any hospital to feel brave enough to walk through those automatic doors alone. The only place open, the only place with lights on and a bathroom she could use without question, was a small 24-hour laundromat on the edge of town. Inside, the tile was cold beneath her palms. The fluorescent light buzzed and flickered with that tired, humming sound old fixtures make. The air smelled like detergent and old mop water. She locked herself in the back stall and tried to keep quiet, because that's what her whole life had trained her to do. Keep quiet. Don't make trouble. Don't let anyone see the mess. Birth didn't listen. Time got strange. Minutes stretched and snapped. At one point, doubled over, forehead pressed against the metal partition, she thought, "I can't do this. I can't do this. There is no way on earth I can do this." And then somehow she did. There, on a thin blanket spread across a bathroom floor, her daughter slid into the world, pink and slippery and furious about the cold. The sound that came out of that tiny body hit Elena like a wave. Before she could think, she heard herself say, "Thank you," out loud, to no one visible. It surprised her, that reflexive gratitude. For a heartbeat, it cut through everything else. Then the fear came roaring back. What now? How do you keep someone alive when you're barely keeping yourself afloat? How do you buy formula when you're counting quarters for gas? How do you bring a newborn back to a car that doesn't have a car seat in a town where a single call to the wrong number could mean someone taking her child away forever? She dried the baby as best she could with rough paper towels, wrapped her in the only warm thing she had that wasn't soaked, an old blue jacket from the trunk, and held her close until both of them stopped shaking quite so hard. The baby's cry faded to small hiccuping breaths against her chest. Elena's mind went to the one place she'd been avoiding, a church. Not the big one back home, with the polished wood and the carefully planned services, a smaller one she'd noticed from the highway late one night, its steeple barely lit, its parking lot half empty even on a Sunday. An old church that felt, somehow, less likely to judge and more likely to simply be there. She drove slowly, every bump in the road making her wince, parked half a block away near an abandoned storefront. The security light over the church door cast a pale halo on the cracked steps. It was so quiet, she could hear her own breath and the tiny sounds from the bundle in her arms. Climbing those steps felt like walking through water. At the top, she hesitated. If she knocked, someone might open the door and find not just a baby, but the whole complicated story attached to her. If she walked away with the baby, she had no idea how either of them would make it through the night. She chose that people on the internet would later argue about in comment sections, never knowing her name. She laid the bundle down as close to the door as she could, tucked into the corner where the wind didn't hit as hard. She smoothed the jacket around that small face, kissed a forehead that smelled like salt and something impossibly new, and whispered, "Please, let someone good find you." Then she stepped back. 1 step, 2. Each one felt like a fracture. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, her legs were trembling. She turned away and walked quickly toward the shadow of the empty store, heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the night. From her hiding place across the street, she watched those steps like the rest of her life depended on them. She expected sirens or headlights sweeping across the churchyard. Instead, she heard a different kind of sound, the soft scrape of claws on concrete, light and precise. A low, questioning rumble, almost like a growl, but gentler. She squinted into the dim light and saw a shape move in from the side. Not a dog, not a person. A bobcat, shoulders rolling with each step, moving up toward the bundle she had just left. Fear surged. Wild animals and infants don't belong in the same frame. But the bobcat didn't lunge, didn't paw. She circled once, twice, and then, unbelievably, lowered herself down over the jacket, tucking her paws in, curling her body around what Elena had just carried there. From the safety of the shadows, Elena pressed a hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. She didn't know whether this was danger or deliverance. All she knew was that her child was no longer alone on those cold steps. Something living, something fierce, had chosen to sit with her through the dark. If you've ever watched someone you love go into a place you couldn't follow, a hospital room, a courtroom, a long-distance move, you know a little of what passed through her then. That helplessness, that tiny, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, they won't be alone in there. Soon, a different set of footsteps will come down that same path, the steady, weary tread of a pastor who thinks it's just another Sunday, until he sees a bobcat and a bundle and realizes his quiet life is about to be turned inside out. As we turn toward Blair, and the moment he opens those sanctuary doors, you might keep Elena in the back of your mind. The choices you see next, his, the wildlife officers, the town's, all unfold in the space her fear and her fragile trust created. And if, while you listen, someone's name keeps nudging at you, someone carrying more shame than support right now, you might just hold them kindly in your thoughts, the way that wild bobcat held a stranger's child on an old church step. Some mornings change your life before the coffee has even finished brewing. By the time the sky over the Arizona ridge had faded from black to deep blue, Blair's day already had a shape in his mind. It was the same shape most Sundays had taken for years now. Wake up in the parsonage, put the kettle on, shuffle through notes for a sermon he wasn't sure anyone would remember by Tuesday. Unlock the old church doors, ring the bell for whoever still came. The house behind the church was quiet, in the way houses get after the kids have gone and the laughter has drained out over time. The photographs on his wall were a little sun-faded. The spare bedroom doors mostly stayed closed. In that quiet, Blair had done what many people his age do. He learned to live around the empty spaces. He wasn't bitter, exactly, just tired. Tired of preaching to fewer faces each year. Tired of feeling like the world had moved on, and forgotten the little white church with the crooked cross and the cracked steps.
In his nightly prayers, he'd stopped asking for big things.
These days, it was more like, if there's anything left that I'm useful for, don't let me miss it. He didn't expect the answer to be sitting 3 feet from his front door.
That morning, he wrapped his old wool coat tight around himself and stepped out into the chill.
The air held that particular desert cold that surprises people who think sand means warmth.
His breath hung in front of him as he walked the short path from parsonage to sanctuary, keys jangling softly in his hand.
He pushed open the double doors, ready to cross the small gap to the bell rope, and that's when everything stopped. On the top step sat a bobcat.
For a split second, his mind refused to take it in.
A wild bobcat, this close to town, this close to him, square in the doorway of his little church. She was more compact than the mountain lions he'd seen in old photographs, but there was no mistaking those tufted ears, that spotted coat, the powerful shoulders gathered beneath her fur. Every sensible instinct in him shouted danger. Predators on a front step are not the kind of visitors you invite in. You felt his heart kick up, his hands go cold in a different way than the January air could explain. Then the bundle under her chest moved. The bobcat's weight shifted, just enough for a sliver of faded blue fabric to show. Something small stirred beneath it. A sound rose from inside that jacket. Thin, rough, unmistakably human. It wasn't a television show cry, neat and strong. It was the raw, scraping sound a body makes when it's cold and tired and still trying. In that instant, Blair's world narrowed to 2 truths that didn't belong together: a wild bobcat and a baby. He took 1 step back, careful not to startle the animal, and eased the doors mostly closed. Inside the dim sanctuary, he groped for the phone on the wall, fingers clumsy on the buttons. He called 911 first. What else do you do when you find an infant and a predator sharing a doorstep? And then, almost as an afterthought, he whispered, "Lord," into the empty air, not sure whether it was a plea or a protest. When the wildlife officer's truck pulled up, tires crunching on gravel, Blair felt a wave of relief so strong he had to steady himself against a pew. Out stepped Mark Rivera, the man the county called when anything with claws or hooves showed up where it shouldn't. Mark approached the situation the way he'd been trained to. Steady, cautious, eyes on the bobcat's body language. Even from a distance, he could see Luna's muscles held taut, not in a pounce, but in a guarding crouch. Her ears twitched toward them and back toward the bundle, like she couldn't decide which risk mattered more. He spoke quietly, mostly for Blair's benefit, but also for anyone watching later. "Bobcats aren't usually like this," he said. "They're shy. They keep their distance. You might catch one on a trail cam, but sitting still near people like this? Over a human baby? That's not in the handbook." He explained what many viewers already know in pieces, but don't often hear all at once. Bobcats are predators, yes, but they avoid humans whenever they can. Ats are rare. This scene, a bobcat resting over an infant on a church step, was not normal, not safe, and not something anyone should ever try to stage or repeat. "I have to get her out of the equation without hurting the baby," Mark said, more to himself than to Blair, as he prepared a tranquilizer dart. "We treat this like a bobcat rescue and a human rescue at the same time." They set up at an angle that kept the church doors as a shield. The range was close, but it had to be. One wrong move and the dart might hit the child. The moment stretched. The only sounds were the soft hum of the security light, the faint rattle of a loose window somewhere, and that fragile breath coming from under the jacket. The dart flew. Luna flinched, a low growl rumbling in her chest, then tried to hold her ground. You could see the wild fight in her eyes, the instinct to stay on that step, even as the sedation pulled her down. It took long seconds, the kind that feel like years, before her head dipped and her body eased enough that Mark could move in. "Go," he said to Blair. Blair stepped out onto the cold concrete, heart hammering. Up close, the bobcat looked both more beautiful and more dangerous than she had from the doorway. He could see the patterns in her fur, the powerful paws, the twitch in her tail, even as the drugs took hold. For a moment, he felt something like awe. Then the bundle at her chest stirred again, snapping him back. Mark gently shifted Luna's legs aside, keeping her head turned away just in case. Blair knelt and reached for the jacket. His fingers brushed fabric stiff with frost, and then found something softer. The round curve of a tiny shoulder, the damp edge of a baby blanket underneath. He lifted the child into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, but warm enough, still here. Her face scrunched as the cold air hit, a weak protest rising from her throat. Without thinking, he tucked her against his chest and pulled his scarf up and around them both, creating what little shelter he could. Inside the church, paramedics would soon check her over, wrap her in proper blankets, and start all the procedures the law requires. Mark would monitor Luna's breathing, call ahead to a wildlife rehab center, and begin the careful process of turning this strange encounter into a safe bobcat rescue story. But for one long, suspended moment on those steps, it was just an old pastor, a wild animal, and a human life that should not have survived the night like this. Later, people would ask Blair if he thought it was a miracle. He never gave a simple answer. Some days he'd say, "I think God uses whatever's willing." And other days, "I don't know. I just know I was given something to do that mattered." Mark, for his part, stuck to what he could measure and still admitted, under his breath, "I've never seen anything like it." It's easy, watching from a distance, to turn a scene like this into a headline or a quick inspiration. But up close, it's messier and more human. Fear, training, instinct, and a quiet, stubborn love for life, all piled together on a cold slab of concrete. In the next stretch of this story, we'll step back from the steps and see how the town reacts. The arguments, the casseroles, the county meetings about land and wildlife. The way one impossible morning ripples through a whole community. As you listen on, you might take a breath and notice who's sitting, metaphorically, on your own front steps right now. The person or situation that feels risky, inconvenient, or strange. And just hold the possibility that stepping toward it gently, the way Blair did, might matter more than you know. In a small town, news doesn't need a headline. It just needs one person to look out a window and say, "You are not going to believe this." By mid-morning, the story of the bobcat on the church steps had already started its slow circle through the community. It moved the way stories do in places like this. From the dispatcher to a cousin, from a paramedic to a spouse, from someone who heard it from Mark himself to the folks in line at the diner. "Bobcat on the church steps," someone said. "With a baby," someone else added. "Still alive," came the part that made everyone pause. At the old white church, the parking lot that had been mostly empty most Sundays was suddenly full of mismatched vehicles. Pickup trucks with feed store stickers, a nurse's sedan, a faded minivan with a car seat already strapped in the back. People stood in small clusters, arms folded against the chill, eyes on the front doors, the way you watch a hospital waiting room door. Inside, the baby, Faith, though no one knew her name yet, was swaddled in hospital blankets, checked over by professionals who had seen a lot, but not this. Out front, near the edge of the concrete, Mark Rivera and another officer stood over a large carrier where Luna, the wild bobcat, lay still under sedation, her breathing steady, her paws tucked in as if she were just napping in a rocky den. Mark answered the same questions over and over. No, she wasn't tame. No, nobody trained her to do that. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, we're taking her to a wildlife rehab center. No, she won't be turned into a pet. He spoke calmly, explaining what he could. Bobcats usually keep to themselves. Their natural wariness of people is what keeps both species safe. Whatever drove Luna to those steps, it was not something anyone should ever try to copy or encourage. "This is a one-in-a-million kind of situation," he said. "Beautiful, in a way, and absolutely not a model." Out of the crowd stepped Mrs. Carver, carrying a box that had once held canned peaches,
and now held baby blankets, folded so neatly you knew she'd ironed them. She pressed it into Blair's hands.
"I kept these," she said, "in case my kids ever needed them again. Turns out maybe they were for somebody else's grandbaby."
She wasn't the only one who came bearing gifts. A retired nurse offered to show Blair how to mix formula. A younger couple arrived with a package of newborn diapers and a note that simply said, "For the little one," with no signature. Now, someone left a second-hand crib on the porch without knocking. Not everyone's first reaction was soft. Tom Dale, who lived across the street and had lost more than one chicken to wild predators, stood with his hands jammed in his pockets, jaw tight. "I don't care how cute it looked," he muttered. "A bobcat that comfortable, that close to people ought to be put down, not coddled. Next time it might not be so sweet." Mark didn't snap back. He just nodded, acknowledging the fear behind the words. "I hear you," he said. "My job is to keep people safe. That's why we sedated her and why we're moving her. But I also have to remember she's a wild animal whose home we chewed up with bulldozers. There's a way to protect your chickens and still respect the bobcats that were here before the cul-de-sac." That was the quiet tug-of-war playing out beneath the surface. Fear and awe, resentment and gratitude, all tangled up in one strange morning. On one side of the parking lot, a county social worker went over paperwork with Blair at a folding table borrowed from the fellowship hall. She spoke gently but firmly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the curious ears nearby. "This little girl will be placed in emergency foster care while we search for her mother," she explained. "Background checks, home visits, all of that still applies, even in unusual situations." Blair looked down at the lines he was signing, the baby's temporary ID number printed where a name would one day go. His hand shook a little. "I live right there," he said, nodding toward the small parsonage. "I don't have much, but I have a roof, a warm room, and Sundays free to hold her. If you'll let me, I'd like to be the one she comes home with, even if it's just until you figure out what comes next." The social worker studied him for a long moment. She'd seen people volunteer for the wrong reasons before. This didn't feel like that. This felt like an old man who thought his useful days were behind him and had just discovered his arms still knew how to hold something fragile. "We'll start the process," she said. "No promises yet, but we'll see." Around them, the town found small ways to choose care, even in disagreement. Tom, the one who'd argued that Luna should be shot, later showed up with his toolbox to fix the drafty window in the room where the baby might sleep. He didn't say he'd changed his mind about bobcats. He just didn't want a newborn catching a cold if she ended up there. At the county offices, Mark brought photos of Luna's old ridge and the new development to a planning meeting. He laid out, without blame in his voice, how fencing and lighting and road placement could either create small corridors for bobcats and other wildlife, or cut them off entirely, leaving hungry animals nosing around dumpsters and backyards. "We can't undo what's already built," he said, "but we can be smarter about what comes next." That's the thing about a story like this. On the surface, it's about a bobcat and a baby and a church. But underneath, it's also about how a community decides who belongs. The wild animals squeezed to the edges, the aging pastor who feels like yesterday's news, the young mother too ashamed to walk through the front door. In the weeks after, people would drive a little slower past the old church, glancing at the steps without meaning to. Some came by just to sit in the pews for a few minutes on a weekday, let the quiet soak in. Others rolled their eyes at the talk of miracles, but still found themselves checking the tree line around their property with a different kind of attention, wondering where the bobcats were making their homes now. Soon, Luna would be fully awake in a rehab pen miles away, watched over by people who specialize in giving wild animals a second chance at a wild life. Elena would be out there somewhere, listening to the story of the church baby on the radio, realizing that the child she left in the cold hadn't just survived, but had been folded into a town's collective heart. That's where we're headed next, into the quiet work of rehab and release, and into a young woman's aching journey back toward the place she thought she'd lost the right to enter. As we go there, you might take a moment to think about your own town, or the nearest thing you have to one, where are the small, ordinary chances to choose care instead of indifference? To look at something strange on your doorstep and say, "I don't understand this, but I'm willing to show up anyway." Some rescues end when a cage door closes. Luna's really began the day it opened. After the scene on the church steps, the bobcat that had held the town's breath didn't disappear into legend. She went into a quiet, practical place, a small wildlife rehab center an hour down the highway, tucked behind a row of cottonwoods and a chain-link fence. There, under soft lights instead of stars, Luna woke up from sedation in a holding pen lined with straw. The smells were strange. Disinfectant, hay, the faint scent of other animals passing through. Her muscles twitched as she tested the space, bumping against wire and wood where her map used to say there would be rock and open air. Dana, the rehab specialist in charge of her care, watched from just outside the enclosure, notebook in hand. She'd worked with a lot of wild animals, hawks caught in barbed wire, deer injured by cars, more than a few bobcats too curious about backyard chickens. But even she had to admit, this one was different. "In 20 years, she said quietly to Mark, who'd driven Luna down, "I have never seen a bobcat choose to sit that close to people for that long, especially near a human baby. It doesn't make sense, but it happened." They kept their distance on purpose. No petting, no hand feeding. No, treating Luna like a mascot for a viral story. The point of rehab is not to make wild animals comfortable with us. It's to give them enough rest and medical care to return to a life where they don't need us at all. When they needed to go in, to change water, to check a healing scratch, to collect samples, they moved with calm efficiency, eyes on her ears, her tail, the subtle signs of stress bobcats show before they bolt or strike. Dana explained it in simple terms for local reporters who called. "She did something extraordinary," she said, "but she's still a bobcat. She's still a predator. We respect that. We don't turn her into a pet. The kindest thing we can do is get her back to a wild place that's safer than the one she came from." Weeks passed. Luna's eyes cleared of the groggy look sedation leaves behind. Her movements sharpened. She paced less and watched more, ears flicking toward sounds outside, the cry of a hawk, the crunch of gravel when someone walked past. The story about the church bobcat faded from the front page, but inside the rehab fence, the work kept going, slow and steady. While Luna healed under Dana's watch, another mother was trying to live with the knowledge of what had happened on those steps. Elena first saw the full story on a screen in a shopping plaza, of all places. Standing outside an electronics store, clutching a small bag of baby formula she'd bought with crumpled bills, she looked up and saw footage she recognized instantly. The church, the steps, the jacket. A news anchor spoke of a grainy security camera clips of Luna slipping through the snow and curling around the bundle. Another shot showed Blair, scarf wrapped around his neck, carrying the baby into the church. The infant, found in stable condition, is now in the care of county services, the voice said. Authorities are still seeking information on the mother. Elena's knees went weak. Relief and shame hit at the same time as hot and cold water poured together. Her daughter was alive. Not just alive, but wrapped in blankets, held by arms that seemed steady. And the whole town knew the story, except the part about the girl who had walked away into the dark. For a while, she did what many of us do when we're overwhelmed by guilt. She ran harder, took extra shifts, drove new back roads to avoid even seeing the silhouette of the old church. Tried not to think about the way the bobcat had curled her body around that jacket, as if some wild part of the world had stepped into the gap she'd left. But you can only outrun your own heart for so long. One evening, weeks later, she parked on a side street just out of sight of the steeple. The baby formula bag on the passenger seat was empty now, crumpled after being used and reused to hold cheap groceries. Her hands sat on the steering wheel long after she turned off the engine. "I still love you," she whispered into the quiet car, not sure whether she meant the baby, the God she'd grown up hearing about, or both. "I just don't know how to do this." Shame told her to stay away. Love tugged her back toward the place where she'd laid her daughter down. and asked for someone good to find her. Love won. The next Sunday, she slipped into the little church and took the last seat in the back row. No one recognized her. She looked like any traveler stopping in. Blair stood at the front, voice steady but softer than it used to be. He wasn't preaching about miracles or wild bobcats that day. He was talking about being entrusted with something you're sure you're not qualified for. Sometimes, he said, glancing toward the front pew where a tiny carrier sat near Mrs. Carver's feet. You're asked to hold a life that arrived in a way you'll never fully understand. And your job is not to solve the mystery. Your job is simply not to drop it. After the benediction, people drifted toward coffee and cookies in the fellowship hall. Elena stayed glued to her seat until almost everyone had left. When she finally stood to go, an older woman with kind eyes handed her a bulletin and said, "We're here on Wednesdays too, if you ever need some midweek company." She didn't know she was speaking to the person whose choices had filled every pew that morning. It took more than one visit, more than one aborted attempt to approach Blair at the door, more than one night sitting in the car outside the parsonage, before Elena finally stepped into his office and told the truth. There were no dramatic speeches, just halting words, long silences, a box of tissues passed quietly across a desk. Blair listened more than he spoke. When she'd finished, he cleared his throat and said, "If you want to be part of her life, we will find a way that keeps her safe. And you steady." With the county's help, they worked out a plan that didn't fit any easy category. Blair would move forward to adopt the baby, giving her a stable home and a name. Elena, as she proved she could keep a job, an apartment, and her own heart less tangled in shame, would be allowed to visit. Not to erase what happened on those steps, but to build something new. One careful meeting at a time. Out at the rehab center, around the same time, Luna's path was coming clear too. She had passed all the checks, strong, wary, no sign that she'd grown too accustomed to people. The decision was made. No captivity, no long-term cage. She would be released. On a gray morning, Mark and Dana loaded her crate into the back of a truck and drove, not toward town, but toward a protected canyon where development was limited, and the land rolled back into rock and scrub. When they opened the gate, Luna hesitated just long enough to scent the wind. Then she leapt forward, disappearing between boulders with the sure-footed grace of a bobcat who'd found something of her old life again. Two mothers. One wild, one human. Both had lost a home. Both were, in their own ways, finding a way back, not to what was, but to what could be. Next, we'll see how that choice plays out over years instead of days, as the baby from the steps grows into someone who has to decide what to do with a story that began before she could remember it. As you follow her, you might think about the parts of your own past you'd rather keep buried, and what it might look like to let even a small bit of light and kindness back into those places, one cautious step at a time. Some stories are told to us so early they start to feel like the air we breathe. For Faith, that story always began with a bobcat on an old church step. She grew up in the space between sanctuary and kitchen, between parsonage and parking lot. The creak of the pews, the smell of coffee and styrofoam cups, the sound of the church bell rope slapping gently against the wall. These were the background music of her childhood, and woven through all of it was the tale people never seemed to tire of telling. The winter morning, a wild bobcat sat on the front steps and refused to move. And 3 years old, the story was simple and bright. Blair would pull her onto his lap in the worn armchair by the window, point out toward the steps and say, "Right there. That's where you were, wrapped up in a blue jacket. And that's where the bobcat sat, right on top, keeping watch." In her mind, the bobcat was almost cartoon soft. Big eyes, round paws, like the stuffed toy Mrs. Carver had given her. Faith would clap her hands and ask the same question every time. "Did she purr?" Blair would smile and say, "Probably not. But I like to think she did. Just a little." By 7, the edges of the story had sharpened. At school, the other kids had Google now. Some of their parents still remembered the news reports.
"You're the church baby,"
one of them said at recess, not unkindly, just curious.
"The one the bobcat didn't eat." That word sat heavily.
That night, in the parsonage, Faith asked,
"Why didn't she? She was a bobcat. Bobcats are dangerous. Mark says so."
Blair set down the dish towel and looked at her carefully.
"Mark's right. Bobcats are wild. They're not safe to pet or play with."
What she did that night, we don't really understand it. All we know is she didn't hurt you. She stayed. Sometimes the world surprises us in ways we can't explain. He didn't try to turn it into a neat miracle. He let the strangeness stay strange. A few years later, on a school trip, that strangeness followed her to the wildlife center where Luna had once stayed. The class shuffled past enclosures of hawks and owls, past a coyote recovering from a leg injury. In the education building, Mark stood by a wall of camera trap photos, explaining how bobcats move along ridges and washes when they think no one is looking. Faith's eyes landed on one picture. A bobcat caught mid-step between rocks, winter coat thick, eyes shining in the flash. It might not have been Luna, there was no way to be sure, but something in the tilt of the head, the purposeful stride, tugged at her.
"That one,"
she said softly, pointing.
"Do you think she remembers us?"
Mark glanced at her, recognizing more than just simple curiosity. He took his time answering.
"I don't know if bobcats remember places the way we do," he said. "They remember where food is, where danger is. What I do know is, we remember her.
And because of her, we started thinking a lot harder about how we build things on their land. For the first time, Faith saw that her story wasn't just about her. It was also about fences moved, lights redirected, a small town learning slowly to share space with the bobcats that had been there first. As she moved into her teens, the story kept changing shape. There were evenings at the parsonage table when Blair and Eleanor sat across from her, steam rising from mugs between them. By then, Eleanor was a regular presence, not every day, but often enough that Faith had learned the particular way her smile trembled when she was nervous, the way her eyes softened whenever Faith laughed. One night, Faith traced the rim of her cup and asked,
"When did you know I was me, not just the baby?"
Elena looked down at her hands.
"Honestly," she said,
"The night I saw you on the news and realized you'd made it inside, I felt like my lungs started working again. But it took longer for me to believe I deserved to be in the same room." Blair didn't jump in to rescue either of them from the honesty. He let the silence sit, then said quietly, "We're all still catching up to what happened, and we probably will be for the rest of our lives." That was the real work of growing up with a bobcat story. Learning to hold gratitude and ache together without letting either one cancel the other out. Faith was alive because a stranger left her where someone could find her. She was alive because a pastor opened his door. She was alive because a wildlife officer did his job. And somewhere in that chain, a wild bobcat had taken a position on a cold step and refused to move. On some nights, lying in her small bedroom with the window cracked open to the desert air, Faith would listen for the sounds that had shaped her life. The bell rope creaking when Blair pulled it on a Sunday morning, the low hum of traffic on the highway, the occasional distant yip of coyotes. She wondered if, out there in the dark, a bobcat padded along a ridge, unaware that a young woman with her name lay awake, thinking about her. She started reading everything she could about bobcats, not to tame the story, but to respect it. She learned how big their territories can be, how they raise their kittens, and how habitat loss pushes them into human spaces. She asked Mark to show her how to set up a camera trap, how to read tracks in dust. The bobcat baby from the old news clip grew into someone who saw wild animals not just as symbols in her origin story, but as neighbors with lives of their own. With each new layer, her identity got both clearer and more complex. She wasn't just the miracle baby, or the girl who was abandoned, or the pastor's kid. She was all of those and more. A person who had been carried by many hands, paws, and choices. If you carry a complicated beginning of your own, adoption papers, divorce documents, a move you never quite processed, you might recognize that feeling. The older you get, the more angles appear. Sometimes it's tempting to pick just one version of the story and cling to it. What Faith was learning, slowly, was that her life was big enough to hold them all. By the time she reached her 20s, the church no longer felt like a place she'd been dropped, but a place she'd chosen. The steps where it all began were still cracked, but they were hers as much as anyone's. And somewhere beyond the town, in a canyon where the houses hadn't yet climbed, bobcats still moved through shadow and scrub, leaving paw prints on ridges that caught the first light of day. Soon we'll step into one more morning on those steps, this time with Faith grown, standing where Luna once sat, deciding what to do with the story she's carried all this way. As we head there, you might take a quiet moment to think about the story you've been told, about how your own life began. Not just the facts, but the meanings you've attached, and consider whether there's a gentler, wider way to hold it. The way Faith has been learning to do, with a wild bobcat always just at the edge of the frame. Some circles don't close with a bang. They close with the quiet sound of someone choosing to stand where their story began. On a mild evening, years after that winter night, Faith stood at the bottom of the same cracked church steps where a wild bobcat once sat over her. The desert light had gone soft and golden, turning the peeling paint on the little white church almost gentle. The security lamp that had once buzzed harsh and cold now had a new bulb. It still hummed, but somehow it felt like part of the place, instead of an apology for it. In her hands, Faith carried a simple wooden frame. Inside was a drawing she'd made as a child, the church as she remembered it then, a little lopsided, a brown and gold bobcat on the top step, the small bundled shape tucked underneath. Across the bottom, in blocky, determined kid handwriting, were the words, "Where my life began." She climbed the steps slowly, not because they were difficult, but because she understood now what they held. Most of us don't get to return to the exact square of concrete where everything almost ended and almost began. She did. And she wasn't here to reenact anything dramatic. She was here to say thank you in a way that felt solid and ordinary. Inside the church, the sanctuary looked a little different. A fresh coat of paint, a few new faces in the pews, an area near the back where folding chairs were set up for weekday support groups. On one wall, near a side door, Faith found the space she'd been picturing for weeks. She hung the framed drawing there, between old photographs of long-ago congregations whose names most people didn't remember. The child's picture looked almost out of place, and perfectly at home. Under it, a small brass plate Blair had ordered read, "Found on these steps one winter morning, watched over by a wild bobcat, raised by many hands." Blair's steps were slower these days, but his eyes were just as steady. He came to stand beside her, looking at the drawing. "You sure about this being out where everyone can see it?" he asked. Faith smiled. "It's been out there my whole life," she said. "Might as well give it a wall." Outside of town, in the protected canyon where Mark and Dana had released Luna and other bobcats like her, evening shadows were stretching long. A trail camera blinked to life as the light faded. Somewhere between the rocks, a bobcat moved, paused, then continued, leaving neat paw prints in the dust. No one could say if it was the same wild bobcat from that long-ago winter, or a daughter, or another animal entirely. What mattered was that there was still room, literal, physical room, for bobcats to live their secret, necessary lives, just beyond the edge of human noise. Faith had helped with that. Not alone, but as part of a slow shift. Weekends spent volunteering with the wildlife team, handing out flyers about keeping pets indoors at night, speaking calmly to school children about respecting wild animals instead of fearing or romanticizing them. She never led with her own story. Sometimes she didn't mention it at all, but every time she traced a paw print in dry soil, every time she checked the memory card on a camera trap, she felt that thin thread connecting back to a bobcat on church steps and a baby wrapped in a blue jacket. She'd learned that faith, small f for capital F, isn't just about what you believe in your head. It's about what you do with your hands when you're tired, and with your time when no one is watching. It's repairing windows in an old parsonage so the next newborn doesn't feel a draft. It's showing up to zoning meetings to talk about wildlife corridors. It's forgiving yourself, slowly,
the way Elena had, one visit at a time, until sitting in a front pew no longer burned with shame, but simply was. For Blair, that morning on the steps had restored something he hadn't even realized was fading. Not a flashy, sermon-ready miracle, but a quiet, stubborn conviction that his life still had room for surprise. He'd asked years before not to be done yet. The answer hadn't come as a thunderclap. It had come as an unexpected weight in his arms and the steady heartbeat of a child who grew up calling his kitchen home. For Faith, the story hadn't erased the hard parts of her beginning. It had taught her that a life can start in a tangle of fear and still grow into something generous. That you can be both abandoned and chosen, both wounded and healing. That a bobcat and a pastor and a frightened young mother can all, in their own way, participate in saving the same life, even if they never quite understand one another. And for the town, that strange morning had become a quiet landmark. People didn't talk about it every day, but it had changed the way they looked at the hills, at each other, at the possibilities hidden in small places. As you sit with this story, maybe you can picture your own steps. They may not be concrete outside a church. They might be the hallway of a hospital, the gravel of a driveway, the threshold of a house you left or returned to. Think for a moment about the people or animals who stood with you when you were colder, more afraid, or more lost than you let on. Chapter: What would it look like to honor that, in some small, concrete way, this week? If this gentle, unlikely bond between a wild bobcat, a child, and a handful of ordinary people has stirred something in you, maybe a bit more tenderness toward yourself, or a bit more trust that the world isn't finished surprising us, I'd love for you to stay part of this little circle. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next quiet story of humans and wild creatures finding a way to share the same ground. And if you feel moved to go one step further, your super thanks or donation helps support real-world efforts to rescue, rehab, and protect wild animals like bobcats, so that the next time a wild animal brushes up against a human one, there's someone ready to help both find their way home.